Evolution of malicious code. So we have viruses. So to begin with, back in the days, we first had viruses, which this was nothing else but a specific type of malware that was able to spread itself once it initially ran on a specific endpoint. It's different from other types of malware because it can either be like a parasite that attaches to good files on your machine, or it can be self-contained and search out other machines to infect. Next, after viruses came up and we found we have implemented security measures like antivirus systems, then the viruses have evolved to what is called worms. Now the difference between viruses and worms is that basically worms move around on their own. So the difference between viruses and worms, the main one is that worms are a smarter versions of viruses that they can duplicate themselves without actually being attached to specific files, and they can also go in the network by themselves and identify other victims and infect other victims as well. So the worm is nothing else but a variation of a virus, which is smarter and again can produce more damage because it can also better hide itself from being detected, but also can infect other executables, other files, and it can also spread by itself across the network more easy than a virus does. Then what came up next was the Trojan horses, which, if you remember the story that you had read in high schools about the big wooden horse that turned out to be full of guys with spears, pretty much that's what a Trojan horse is. Like, for example, the user receives a PDF file or a JPEG file across email or across web, opens up the file, it looks legitimate because it's a JPEG, but actually behind the scenes, behind the file, a malicious code resides, which once the user has opened up the file, code has been executed and the endpoint got infected and maybe got also owned, which means it became a botnet, so the attacker can actually take control of the endpoint, send specific instructions to the endpoint in order to launch, as we've seen before, DDoS attacks or DOS attacks. Nowadays, what we deal with is what is called advanced persistent threats, which is a set of very specific hacking processes or hacking phases or hacking tools, but with a specific target. So it's called advanced because it's a very specific and very advanced targeted attack. It's called and for that reason, most of such attacks also makes use of zero-day vulnerabilities, so unknown vulnerabilities, which means those are going to be unpatched. And it's called persistent because the scope of such attack is to be stealth to begin with, so none is going to be very difficult to be discovered. So when you infect an endpoint with an APT malicious code, that endpoint is going to be very difficult for the network to identify that the endpoint is infected. So that an attacker can infect an endpoint and instruct the malicious code to keep silent for, I don't know, 6 months, for example, or 3 months. And then it can instruct the code to wake up 6 months later, and even at that point, in order not to be discovered, because that's another characteristic of APT threats, is that they're not easily discoverable. The attacker can also configure or instruct the malicious code so that is going to try and do bad things in the network very rarely, not often. So like a virus or a worm was not that smart. A virus or a worm was constantly trying to do damage in the network, constantly trying to do what it was configured and instructed to do. But an APT threat, the malicious code which is being used in this kind of threat is going to keep silence and is going to rarely and very rarely do bad things in the network. And so that allows for him to be stealth and very difficult to be caught in action, to call it that way.